Her water broke on a night bus, and the vampire king, traveling incognito in the back row, smelled the blood and amniotic fluid instantly. But instead of feeding, he stood, his eyes flashing crimson as he compelled every passenger off at the next stop. The bus driver's hands shook on the wheel as the vampire king knelt beside her, offering his coat and an impossible choice. Maya Chen had been riding night buses for 3 weeks straight, sleeping in 24-hour diners when exhaustion won, moving because stillness meant Derek could find her. And tonight, the 11:47 Crosstown Express smelled like every other bus she'd taken, diesel fumes mixing with wet polyester and the particular staleness of public transit after midnight. She pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching streetlights blur past in the rain. One hand cradling the swell of her belly where the baby had been kicking less today, which the free clinic nurse said was normal at 8 months, but Maya couldn't stop worrying about it anyway. The first contraction hit like a fist, squeezing her entire midsection, and she gasped, gripping the metal pole beside her seat, telling herself it was Braxton Hicks, just practice contractions, nothing real. But then wetness spread down her thighs, and she looked down to see her jeans darkening with fluid that caught the fluorescent overhead lights. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel, and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The smell changed instantly, something coppery and organic cutting through the diesel, and that's when she noticed the man in the back row sit up straighter, his nostrils flaring like an animal catching scent on the wind. He'd been slouched there since she boarded, leather jacket worn soft at the elbows, dark hair falling across his face, and she'd clocked him as harmless, just another late-shift worker heading home. But now his eyes opened, and they reflected the light wrong, too bright, too red, pupils blown wide as he stared directly at her. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs because she knew that look, had seen it in Derek's eyes right before his fists started flying. But this was different, sharper, hungrier, and the man stood in one fluid motion that shouldn't have been possible for someone who'd appeared half asleep seconds before. 3 centuries ago, Lucian Thorne had returned from the Hungarian campaigns to find his sister Elise laid out in their family chapel, her lips blue, her hands crossed over a stomach that had been swollen with child when he left and was now empty and cold, the midwife whispering that she'd bled too much, that the baby never drew breath, and Lucienne had knelt in her blood on those stone floors and sworn an oath that no mother would die alone while he still walked the earth, which seemed laughable now given what he'd become. But the oath was burned into him deeper than any vampire compulsion, written in the marrow of who he'd been before the turning. The bus held maybe 15 passengers scattered across the seats, a woman with grocery bags, 2 men in construction gear, a teenager with headphones, all of them oblivious as Maya's water broke and Lucian felt every molecule of his predatory nature scream at him to feed, because amniotic fluid carried blood, and blood was everything. But underneath that hunger the oath pulled tighter, and he moved down the aisle with his hands carefully loose at his sides, his voice dropping to a register that bypassed conscious thought and hit the brainstem directly. "Get off," he said, and it wasn't loud, but it vibrated in the bones of every human on that bus, their faces going slack as they stood and shuffled toward the exits like sleepwalkers. The grocery woman leaving her bags, the construction workers abandoning their lunch coolers, even the driver's hands moving mechanically to pull the bus to the curb under a broken streetlight that flickered and died as they stopped. The teenager was the last one off, headphones still blasting music no one else could hear, and then it was just Maya doubled over in her seat, and Lucian standing in the aisle with rain hammering the roof so hard it sounded like drumfire. She looked up at him with eyes that were dark and terrified, but not surprised, like she'd been expecting the world to turn monstrous eventually. And maybe she had been. "I can get you to a hospital in 4 minutes, Lucienne said, kneeling beside her seat so they were eye level, rain streaming down the windows behind him. "But you'll owe me a debt, or I leave you here and you take your chances." His eyes had faded from crimson to something almost human, almost kind. But she could see the truth in the way he held himself too still, the way he didn't blink, the wrongness that clung to him like frost. What kind of debt? Maya managed through the tail end of the contraction, her fingers digging into the vinyl seat. And Lucian's jaw tightened because he'd given this speech before, centuries of deals and bargains. But never like this. Never with someone who had no other choice. The kind that binds your child to my house, he said. Protection, education, a future. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them because what future did he have to offer? A fallen vampire king running from his own kind. But it was better than bleeding out on a night bus while her baby suffocated inside her. Maya's next contraction built fast, 3 minutes after the first, and she reached out without thinking and grabbed his hand, which was cold as marble and just as hard, and she said, "Fine, just please." And the deal snapped into place between them like a circuit completing. Lucian compelled the driver with a gesture, his voice barely above a whisper, and the man's foot slammed the accelerator, the bus lurching forward through streets slick with rain, taking corners too fast, the tires shrieking against wet asphalt. Maya braced herself against the seat in front of her, breathing in short, sharp gasps, and Lucian shed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked with silver scars that formed patterns like ritualistic script. The remnants of duels fought with blessed blades that never fully healed, even on vampire flesh. "In through your nose," he coached, his voice gentler than it had been, almost human in its warmth. "Out slowly. You're stronger than the pain." He'd said these exact words to Elise once, during a fever when she was 12 and he was still mortal, and the memory tasted like ash. Maya tried to follow his rhythm, her hand still gripping his, and for 30 seconds she almost believed they'd make it, that this stranger with impossible eyes and a voice like compulsion would actually save her. But then she looked past him through the rain-streaked window and saw the drone. It hung in the air like a mechanical wasp, its body matte black, its lens glowing red as it tracked their movement. And Lucian saw her expression change and turned to look and cursed in Old French, the words harsh and guttural. "They found me," he said, and Maya gasped out who between contractions, her whole body shaking now from adrenaline and pain. "The consilium," Lucian answered, still watching the drone. "Vampire ruling council. They don't appreciate kings who break betrothals." His hand went to the pendant at his throat, a piece of worked silver in the shape of a thorned crown, ancient and heavy, especially not for a human in labor. The pendant pulsed with faint light as he touched it, some kind of magic Maya couldn't begin to understand, and he pulled it over his head and pressed it into her free hand. "If I don't make it," he said, meeting her eyes, "show this to the ER staff. Tell them Lucian Thorne invoked the sanctuary clause. They'll know what it means." The metal was warm from his skin, which shouldn't have been possible if he was really what she thought he was. But before Maya could process that, the drone fired, and the back window exploded inward in a spray of glass and silver filament, a net that crackled with electricity as it spread through the air. The bus swerved violently, the driver's compulsion breaking as raw panic took over, and Maya screamed as the seat tilted under her. But Lucian was already moving, faster than her eyes could track, his body a blur as he twisted and caught the net with his bare hands, the silver burning his palms with a sound like meat on a griddle and a smell that made Maya gag. He threw himself over her, his back taking the brunt of the glass, his arms caging her against the seat as the bus fishtailed and clipped a parked car, metal shrieking against metal. And then they were spinning, the world tilting sideways, streetlights and storefronts whirling past the windows until the bus slammed into a light pole and stopped with a jolt that threw Maya forward into Lucian's chest. For 3 heartbeats, there was only the sound of rain and the hiss of the bus's damaged engine, and Maya's ragged breathing against Lucian's shoulder, his body solid and cold and utterly still above her like a statue. And then he pulled back and she saw the burns on his hands, the skin blackened and peeling, and the glass embedded in his back where his shirt had torn open. But his eyes were focused only on her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, and Maya shook her head because somehow she wasn't. He'd taken all of it, and another contraction hit, and she doubled over with a sound that was half sob, half scream. The Vampire King looked at her ruined hands, and then at the drone circling back for another pass, and made a decision. Kicking out the remaining glass from the emergency exit and lifting Maya as carefully as if she were made of porcelain, stepping out into the rain that immediately soaked them both. The hospital was 4 blocks away, he'd said 4 minutes. But now the drone was descending and 2 more appeared from the clouds, their lenses all glowing red in the darkness. And Lucien started to run with Maya cradled against his chest, his burned hands leaving marks on her wet clothes, his speed inhuman as he blurred between streetlights. The world streaking past in shades of gray and gold, and Maya clung to him with one hand still gripping the pendant, and the other wrapped around her belly, where her daughter was trying to be born into a night that had gone from desperate to impossible. She could hear rotors cutting through the rain, mechanical and precise, could see shadows moving on rooftops, and Lucian's jaw was set in a line that looked like fury and resignation mixed together. The expression of someone who'd already lost everything and was trying to save one last thing that mattered. The ER entrance appeared ahead, automatic doors and fluorescent lights that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness. And Lucian didn't slow, didn't stop, just crashed through the ambulance bay with Maya in his arms and blood running from his hands, and the pendant glowing white-hot between them. And the last thing Maya saw before the hospital erupted into chaos was a woman in a white coat going pale at the sight of the silver-thorned crown and whispering something that sounded like code black as alarms began to shriek through every corridor. The ambulance bay doors had never been designed to withstand the impact of a full-grown vampire king moving at combat speed, and they buckled inward with a screech of metal that sent nurses scattering and orderlies diving behind medication carts as Lucian Thorne strode through with Maya Chen cradled in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. Alarms shrieked from every corner of the emergency room, red lights pulsing in time with the sound, and security guards converged from 3 directions with hands on holstered weapons, but they all froze mid-draw when they saw the pendant pressed against Maya's chest, glowing so bright it cast shadows across her rain-soaked face. Dr. Rashid emerged from behind the intake desk, a thin man with silver-streaked temples and the kind of exhausted eyes that came from 20 years of overnight shifts in a hospital that served both human and supernatural populations. And the color drained from his face as he recognized the thorned crown symbol burning white against the darkness. "Sanctuary clause," he said, his voice cutting through the alarms with the authority of someone who'd invoked ancient protocols before. "Code black." He turned to his staff, who stood frozen in a tableau of shock and confusion. "Clear trauma." "One now," he ordered, and they moved instantly, years of training overriding their fear as they scrambled to prepare the room. Dr. Rashid stepped closer to Lucian, close enough that Maya could see the fine tremor in his hands, though his voice stayed steady. "You're invoking debt bond for her," he said. And it wasn't quite a question. Lucien nodded once, sharp and certain. "And the child," he added. And something passed between the 2 men, some understanding that Maya couldn't parse through the fog of another contraction building in her core. Dr. Rashid leaned in close enough that Maya could smell coffee on his breath and antiseptic on his clothes. "The consilium will burn this hospital down if they think you're hiding here," he said, voice barely above a whisper, and Lucian's smile was all edges. No warmth. The expression of a predator who'd stopped pretending to be anything else. "Then they'll answer to the Human Protection Accords," Lucian replied. "Section 9. A mother in active labor is untouchable, even by vampire law." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Even by them. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and Dr. C. Rashid's expression flickered between respect and resignation before he gestured sharply toward the trauma bay. Two nurses appeared with a gurney, and Lucian set Maya down with a gentleness that contradicted everything about him, his burned hands leaving smudges on the white sheets. And then she was being wheeled down a corridor that smelled like bleach and fear, while fluorescent lights strobed overhead. The sterile white room they brought her to was all gleaming surfaces and beeping machines, monitors that tracked her heartbeat and the babies in parallel lines of green light. And nurses moved around her with urgent efficiency, cutting away her wet clothes, fitting an IV line into her arm, their hands impersonal and professional. Through the window that looked out into the hallway, Maya could see Lucian arguing with Dr. Rashid, his hands moving in sharp gestures that left trails of blackened skin flaking away, his face a mask of controlled fury that made the doctor take an involuntary step back. Who is he? Maya thought, as another contraction peaked and receded, leaving her gasping. What have I agreed to? The pendant still lay against her chest, cooler now, but still humming with some kind of energy she could feel in her teeth, and she closed her fingers around it like a talisman against everything that was happening too fast and too strange. The anesthesiologist arrived with an epidural kit, explaining the procedure in a calm monotone that Maya barely heard over the roaring in her ears. And she felt the needle slide between her vertebrae, the cold spread of medication that should have brought relief but didn't, her body rejecting it somehow. The pain continuing to build in waves that made her cry out. The anesthesiologist frowned, checked the placement, administered a second dose, but nothing changed, and Maya could see concern creeping into the faces around her, the nurses exchanging glances, Dr. Rashid being summoned back into the room. Her body is rejecting it, the anesthesiologist said, bewildered. And that's when Lucian pushed through the door despite the protests, despite Dr. Rashid's hand on his shoulder trying to hold him back. I've delivered 17 children across 4 centuries, Lucien said quietly, moving to Maya's side. Trust me. His burned hands had already begun to heal, the blackened skin sloughing away to reveal pink flesh underneath, and when he placed one palm against her forehead, it was cold as a compress, shocking relief against the fever that had built under her skin. Dr. Rashid opened his mouth to object, to cite hospital policy or supernatural protocol or something, but Maya reached out and grabbed Lucien's other hand, holding tight, and the doctor fell silent. The contractions came faster now, 2 minutes apart, then 90 seconds, the pain like nothing Maya had ever experienced, like her body was tearing itself apart from the inside, and Lucien stayed beside her, coaching her breathing again, his voice low and steady. When the worst of it hit and Maya screamed through gritted teeth, he began to murmur something in a language she didn't recognize, syllables that flowed like water, and it took her a moment to realize it was a lullaby, old and sad and achingly gentle. His voice cracked on the chorus, and she saw something in his face that wasn't the vampire king or the supernatural creature, just a brother who'd lost his sister, who'd failed someone he loved, who was trying desperately not to fail again. Between contractions, in the brief windows of clarity, Maya's mind wandered to 3 weeks ago, to the moment Derek found the positive pregnancy test in the bathroom trash. She'd known instantly from his expression that everything was about to change, the way his face went from confusion to rage in the space of a heartbeat, and his fist had caught her across the jaw before she could explain or plead or run. The locked doors came next, 3 days of being trapped in their apartment while he decided what to do with her, with the baby, his anger alternating with apologies that meant nothing. And Maya had waited until he passed out drunk before she took the emergency cash from his jacket and the spare phone from the kitchen drawer and ran. She'd been running ever since, sleeping on buses because they were warm and public and moving, eating from dollar menus, avoiding anywhere Derek might think to look. And tonight she'd thought maybe she'd finally made it far enough, gotten safe enough. But her water broke and the world proved once again that safety was an illusion. Now she was here, in a hospital surrounded by vampires and ancient laws, bound by a debt she didn't understand to a man who wasn't a man at all, and her daughter was trying to be born into all of this chaos. Push, Dr. Rashid instructed, and Maya bore down with everything she had, her hand crushing Lucian's, her body doing what it had been designed to do despite her terror. The lullaby continued in that old language, Lucian's voice wrapping around her like a spell, and she pushed again and again, time losing meaning in the repetition of effort and pain and breath. At 2:17 a.m. by the clock on the wall, a baby girl slid into Lucian Thorne's waiting hands, small and covered in vernix and blood, and for a terrible moment, she was silent, not breathing, not crying, just limp and blue-tinged in the harsh light. Lucian's eyes widened, and Maya felt her heart stop, felt the world narrow to that tiny, unmoving body. But then Lucian lifted the baby and turned her, rubbing her back with precise pressure in a specific pattern, and the infant gasped and wailed, the sound piercing and furious, and the most beautiful thing Maya had ever heard. He wrapped the baby in his leather jacket, the worn material swallowing her tiny form, and placed her on Maya's chest with a gentleness that made Maya's throat tight. "She's perfect," Lucien said, and his voice was rough with an emotion Maya couldn't name. The baby's eyes were dark and knowing, too aware for someone only seconds old, and she stared up at Maya like she recognized her, like they'd known each other in some life before this one. Maya's hands came up to cradle her daughter, this impossible creature she'd made, and tears streamed down her face, mixing with sweat and relief. The nurses moved in to clamp and cut the cord, to do their assessments, but Maya couldn't look away from her baby's face, from the miracle of her breathing. Then the lights cut out. Emergency generators kicked in half a second later, bathing the room in red, turning everything the color of blood and warning. And through the window, Maya saw figures in black tactical gear pouring into the ER, moving with coordinated precision, their faces hidden behind helmets and visors. Lucien's expression hardened into something ancient and dangerous, his body going still in that predatory way, and he moved to the window, placing himself between Maya and whatever was coming. "They're here," he said, and the words were flat and final, and Maya clutched her daughter closer, the baby's wails quieting to confused whimpers, and understood with cold certainty that the real danger had only just begun. The red emergency lighting turned everything in the delivery room into shades of crimson and shadow, and when the 3 consilium enforcers entered, they moved like smoke, their black tactical gear absorbing light, their presence sucking warmth from the air. The leader removed her helmet to reveal platinum hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and eyes like frozen mercury that swept the room with clinical assessment before landing on Lucian Thorne with something that might have been amusement. "Lucian," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent of old European aristocracy, "you missed your wedding." Her smile was all sharp edges, a blade wrapped in pleasantries. "The Countess Armitage is displeased." Lucian positioned himself between the enforcers and Maya's bed, his body a wall, his hands loose at his sides but ready. "I invoked sanctuary," he said, each word precise and hard. "You have no authority here." Cassandra Voss laughed, the sound like ice cracking, and her 2 companions fanned out to flank her, their movements synchronized and predatory. "We have every authority," she replied, pulling off her tactical gloves finger by finger with deliberate slowness. "The debt bond isn't ratified until the child is named and the contract sealed in blood. Right now, she's just a human you helped. Walk away, and we'll consider your breach of contract a temporary lapse in judgment." Maya clutched her daughter tighter against her chest, the baby's warmth the only real thing in a room that had gone cold and strange, and she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as Cassandra's mercury eyes found her across the space. Dr. Rashid stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the monitors, holding a tablet that glowed blue in the red light. "Actually," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor Maya could see in his hands. The bond was sealed the moment he accepted her acceptance. Verbal contracts are binding under the Montreal Accords of 1847. He turned the tablet to show Cassandra, and Maya caught a glimpse of grainy surveillance footage, the bus interior, her own face twisted in pain and terror, her voice saying, "Fine, just please," and Lucian's single sharp nod. Cassandra's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, calculation running behind the mercury surface. "Coercion voids consent," she said, shifting her attention fully to Maya. She was in duress. Her smile softened into something almost gentle, almost kind, the expression of someone used to manipulating through sympathy. "Did he threaten you, Maya Chen? Did he force you to accept his terms while you were in pain and vulnerable?" Maya's arms tightened around her daughter, and the baby made a small sound, not quite a cry. Her dark eyes fixed on Cassandra with an awareness that shouldn't have been possible for someone less than an hour old. "He saved us," Maya said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected, clear and certain. "That's all the consent I need." The words hung in the air, and Cassandra's gentle expression evaporated, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Then you've made your choice," she said. "Both of you." She reached inside her tactical coat and withdrew a rolled document, the vellum yellow and ancient-looking, tied with black ribbon that she pulled loose with a sharp tug. "The Armitage line demands recompense," Cassandra continued, unrolling the document with a flourish that made the material crackle. "Lucian Thorne, you are stripped of your kingship effective immediately. Your house, your lands, your title, all forfeit." She looked at Maya, her mercury eyes cold as winter. "And the child becomes ward of the consilium until her 18th year. Compensation for breach of contract." "No," Lucian said, and the word vibrated through the room like a tuning fork struck hard, the lights flickering in response, the monitors glitching and resetting, Maya's IV stand rattling against the tile floor. "You will not touch her." The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and Maya could see her breath now, could see frost forming on the window glass. And Lucian looked nothing like the gentle presence who'd coached her breathing and sung lullabies in Old French. He looked ancient and terrible and barely contained, power rolling off him in waves that made Maya's teeth ache. Cassandra seemed unbothered by the display, dropping the document onto Maya's bed, where it landed with a wet sound that made Maya's stomach turn when she realized the vellum wasn't paper at all, but skin, human skin, and the ornate calligraphy was written in something dark and rust-colored that could only be blood. "Sign by Dawn," Cassandra said, checking a watch on her wrist that looked older than the hospital itself. "Or we take the child by force. Vampire law supersedes human in matters of debt." She gestured to her two companions, who moved toward the door with military precision. "You have 4 hours." The enforcers left as silently as they'd arrived, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded final, and for a long moment no one moved, the room frozen in tableau. Then Dr. Rashid crossed to the door and engaged the lock, his movements jerky with suppressed panic. And Lucian began to pace, 3 steps, 1 direction, pivot, 3 steps back, feral energy barely contained in the confines of the small space. Maya rocked her daughter automatically, the motion instinctive, her mind numb with shock as she stared at the document on her bed, at the terrible wrongness of it. Dr. Rashid cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There's a loophole," he said carefully, like someone navigating a minefield. "If the child is named in a human ceremony with witnesses, she gains dual citizen status. The consilium can't claim her without triggering the accords. It would be considered kidnapping under human law, which they're bound to respect in matters of mixed heritage." Lucien stopped pacing, turning to face the doctor. "Human ceremonies require a birth certificate," he said, "which requires time we don't have." His jaw worked, thinking. "Unless we invoke the emergency baptism clause. 3 witnesses, a naming, and a vow of protection from a supernatural guardian." Dr. Rashid nodded slowly. It's risky. If they challenge it, claim the ceremony wasn't legitimate, you'd have to defend it in front of a tribunal. And you'd need witnesses willing to stand against the consilium, which is not a small thing to ask. I'll do it, Maya said, and both men turned to look at her. What do I have to say? She looked up at Lucienne, at this impossible creature who'd lost everything in the space of an hour. And what do you get out of this? You've lost everything because of me. Lucien crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, bringing himself eye level with her, and Maya could see exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. I've been king for 400 years, he said quietly. I've signed treaties in blood, executed traitors, married for alliance. I've watched empires rise and fall. I've done terrible things in the name of political necessity. He paused, his hand hovering over the baby's head, not quite touching. I've never once chosen something just because it was right. His eyes met Maya's, and she saw honesty there, raw and painful. She's the first choice I've made that means something. I'm not losing that. The baby made a small sound, her tiny fist curling around the edge of Lucien's leather jacket that still swaddled her, and something in Maya's chest cracked open. Some wall she'd built around herself during 3 weeks of running and 3 days of captivity and 23 years of learning not to trust anyone. Okay, she said, tell me what to say. Dr. Rashid moved to the computer terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I'll pull up the exact wording. It's old, ceremonial, but legally binding if done correctly. We'll need 3 witnesses minimum. I can stand as one. You'll need 2 more willing to testify if challenged. Lucien stood, scanning the room like he was calculating odds. There are nurses who owe me favors, he said. Old debts. They'll stand witness if I call them. Dr. Rashid nodded, still typing. Then we do this now, before Cassandra can return with reinforcements. Once the naming is complete and recorded, the child has legal protection under both systems. They can't simply take her. Maya shifted her daughter in her arms, looking down at the tiny face, the dark eyes that seemed to see everything. What should I name her, she wondered aloud, and Lucien's expression softened. That's your choice, he said. She's your daughter. Maya thought of her own mother, dead 5 years now from cancer, who'd tried her best with limited resources and bad choices in men. She thought of running, of night buses and locked doors and the smell of diesel mixed with rain. She thought of this moment, this strange salvation, and opened her mouth to speak the name that felt right, that felt like hope and new beginnings and second chances. But before she could form the words, the door exploded inward, the lock shattering, and Derek stumbled through with a gun in his shaking hands, his face red and sweating, his eyes wild with rage and something that looked like drugs or madness or both. I knew you'd go to a hospital eventually, he snarled at Maya, the gun swinging between her and Lucien. You bitch. You can't just take my kid and run. That's my baby. The baby began to cry, sharp and frightened, and Maya's whole body went cold with a terror more primal than anything the consilium had inspired, because she knew Derek's violence, had felt it, had the scars to prove it. Lucien moved to intercept, placing himself between the gun and the bed, but Derek was already pulling the trigger, the sound deafening in the small space, and Maya screamed as everything slowed and time stuttered, and she thought, this is how it ends, this is how we die. But the bullet never reached its target because Cassandra Voss materialized behind Derek with impossible speed, her hand snapping his wrist with a crack that made Maya's stomach turn, the gun clattering to the floor as Derek howled in pain. See, Cassandra said, looking at Lucien with a smile that was all teeth. We're not monsters. We protect human life. Her mercury eyes glittered. Now you owe us for this intervention. Another debt. Derek crumpled to the floor with his broken wrist cradled against his chest, keening in pain, and Cassandra stepped over him like he was debris, her platinum hair catching the red emergency light as she moved further into the room with predatory grace. Security pounded on the door from outside, but Derek had jammed the mechanism with something, Maya could hear shouting and the crackle of radios, but none of it mattered because Cassandra was smiling at Lucian like she'd just won a game he hadn't known they were playing. "You sent him," Lucian said, his voice flat and dangerous. "You told him where to find her." Cassandra examined her nails. Perfect ovals painted deep burgundy. "I merely removed a tracking block from his phone," she said, her tone conversational. "What he did with the information was his choice." She glanced down at Derek, who was sobbing now, rocking back and forth, his face a mess of tears and snot and rage. "But saving this human woman from her violent ex, that's a consilium service." Her mercury eyes found Lucienne again. "And services require payment." Maya felt the baby's weight against her chest, warm and alive and impossibly vulnerable, and something hardened in her that had been soft before, something that had spent 3 weeks running and a lifetime accepting what men decided for her. "She's not yours," Maya said, her voice cutting through Derek's sobs, and he looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. "You beat me, Derek. You locked me in the apartment for 3 days. You held me down when I tried to leave." She shifted the baby slightly, protective. "You don't get to be a father now." Derek tried to stand, cradling his shattered wrist. "That's my kid," he slurred, and Maya could smell the whiskey on him from across the room, could see the red-rimmed desperation in his eyes. "You can't just take her. I got rights." Lucian's eyes flashed crimson, and he took one step toward Derek. Just one, but it was enough to make the man scramble backward. "Put your hands on her again," Lucian said quietly, "and I'll show you exactly how outmatched you are." Derek laughed, high and manic, spittle flying. "By what?" he said. "Some goth pretty boy who thinks he's tough? I'll break you, just like I broke her." The temperature in the room dropped and Maya saw frost forming on the windows again, saw the monitors flicker, but Cassandra raised one hand in a gesture that was somehow both casual and absolute. "Enough," she said. "Derek is no longer relevant to this negotiation." She looked at Dr. Rashid, who stood frozen near the computer terminal. "Have security remove him. Press charges for assault, breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, whatever the human system requires." Dr. Rashid moved to unlock the door, and security flooded in, 3 men who took in the scene with wide eyes before hauling Derek to his feet. And he fought them, screaming obscenities at Maya, at Lucian, at everyone, but they dragged him out, and the door closed again, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos had been. "Now," Cassandra said, smoothing her tactical jacket, "about that debt." She began to pace, her movements liquid and controlled. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble tonight, Lucian Thorne. Broken betrothal, invoked sanctuary, bonded yourself to a human and her child, all very dramatic and very costly. The consilium cannot allow such behavior to go unanswered." Lucian stood his ground between Cassandra and Maya's bed. "I've broken no laws," he said. "Everything I've done is within the accords." Cassandra's smile was sharp. "Technically true," she acknowledged, "but politics isn't about legality, as you well know. It's about perception. And right now the perception is that you've made the consilium look weak, that you've chosen a random human over your responsibilities to vampire society." She stopped pacing, turning to face him fully. "We need to correct that perception." "I'll make you a deal, Fallen King," she said, and the formality of the title made it an insult. "Single combat, you versus our champion. You win, the child goes free, full dual citizen status, no challenges, and you're reinstated with full honors as king of your house." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "You lose, and the child becomes consilium property until her 18th year. And Maya Chen signs a 20-year contract as blood servant to House Armitage." "No," Maya said immediately, but Cassandra ignored her, keeping her attention on Lucienne. "Those are the terms," Cassandra continued. "Non-negotiable. You can accept or we can proceed with our original plan and take the child by force at dawn. Your choice." Lucian was very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. "Who's your champion?" he asked, and Cassandra's smile widened. "Victor Cross," she said, and even Dr. Rashid made a small sound of dismay. 1,200 years old, House Armitage's executioner. He's killed 17 vampire lords in sanctioned duels. She tilted her head. "But I'm sure you already knew that." Maya didn't know what was happening, but she could read Lucien's expression, the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands curled into fists. "This is a trap," Dr. Rashid said quietly. "Victor has never lost." Cassandra shrugged. Then perhaps Lucien shouldn't have broken his betrothal. She moved toward the door. "You have 5 minutes to decide. The arena is prepared below. We'll be waiting." She paused at the threshold. "Oh, and Lucien, don't bother trying to run. We have the hospital surrounded. This ends tonight, one way or another." When she was gone, Lucien turned to Maya, and his face was a landscape of exhaustion and resignation. "I have to accept," he said. "It's the only way." "You could die," Maya said, and her voice shook. "Then at least I'll have died for something that mattered," Lucien replied. He looked at the baby in her arms, still unnamed, still watching everything with those two knowing eyes. "She deserves a chance. You both do." Dr. Rashid was already moving, unlocking the bed's wheels. "If we're doing this," he said, "we need to go now. They'll use the delay as grounds to void the offer." He looked at Maya. "Can you handle being moved?" Maya nodded, not trusting her voice, and they wheeled her bed out of the delivery room and down corridors she'd never seen, past storage rooms and administrative offices, to an elevator that required Dr. Rashid's keycard to access. The descent seemed to take forever, the numbers ticking down past the basement levels, past sub-basement, into depths that shouldn't have existed beneath a hospital. When the doors opened, Maya smelled earth and stone, and something older, the air heavy with moisture, and the particular cold that came from being deep underground. The arena was carved from living rock, a circular pit maybe 30 feet across, with stone walls that rose up to an observation gallery, where vampires in formal dress were already gathering, their faces pale and hungry in the torchlight that provided the only illumination. It looked medieval, ritualistic, like something that had been here long before the hospital was built above it, and Maya realized with sick certainty that this place had seen blood before, had been designed for it. Dr. Rashid wheeled her bed to an alcove in the gallery where she had a clear view of the pit below, and Maya clutched her daughter close, the baby's warmth the only real thing in this nightmare. The crowd of vampires watched her with open curiosity, their eyes reflecting the torchlight in shades of amber and red and gold. And she heard whispers in languages she didn't recognize, saw gestures that might have been sympathy or might have been contempt. Lucien appeared at the edge of the pit, and the crowd fell silent. He stripped off his shirt, revealing a body marked with scars that formed a tapestry of violence, each one a story of survival, some silver and puckered where blessed weapons had cut him, some darker where fire had burned, all of them proof that he'd lived through things that should have killed him. He looked up at Maya, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words, and then he dropped down into the pit. Cassandra stood at the opposite edge in a gown now instead of tactical gear, deep purple silk that looked black in the torchlight. "The rules," she announced, her voice carrying through the stone chamber. "First blood to surrender or death. No weapons except what you bring, no outside interference. The winner's terms stand without challenge." She gestured and a figure stepped from the shadows beside her. Victor Cross was massive, easily 7 feet tall, built like something carved from stone and given terrible life. His face was a ruin of scar tissue, his eyes like dead coals set deep in his skull, and when he dropped into the pit, the impact sent tremors through the floor. He wore leather pants and nothing else, his torso covered in scars that made Lucien's look minor by comparison, and when he flexed his hands, bone claws slid out from beneath his fingernails, each one 6 inches long and gleaming silver in the firelight. Those are illegal, Dr. Rashid said, his voice tight. Bone grafts, silver-infused. They're banned under the Accords. Cassandra smiled up at him from across the pit. We're not bound by human laws tonight, she said. This is vampire justice. Traditional rules apply. She raised one hand. Begin. Victor moved, and it was like watching a landslide gain sentience, unstoppable momentum combined with devastating force, and his claws swept toward Lucien's throat in an arc that would have decapitated him if it connected. But Lucien was faster, dropping and rolling, his smaller size an advantage in close quarters, and he came up behind Victor with his own claws extended, normal vampire claws, and raked them across the bigger vampire's back. Blood welled, black in the torchlight, and the crowd roared, the sound echoing off stone walls until it was deafening. Victor spun with impossible speed for something so large and caught Lucien across the ribs, the silver claws opening gashes that went deep, and Lucien staggered back, blood spraying across the dirt floor of the pit. Maya watched with her heart in her throat, the baby pressed against her chest, and she found herself whispering, "Please, please, please," like a prayer to gods she didn't believe in. Victor pressed his advantage, driving Lucien back against the pit wall with a combination of strikes that were too fast to follow. And Lucien blocked and dodged, but he was slowing, weakening, and Maya remembered what Cassandra had said about him not feeding for 3 days, about the compulsion and healing draining him. He was fighting at a disadvantage, and Victor knew it, could smell the weakness, and he smiled with a mouthful of filed teeth as his claws found Lucien's shoulder and tore through muscle. Lucien cried out, the first sound of pain Maya had heard from him, and went down on one knee, and the crowd's roar intensified, bloodlust filling the air like perfume, and Maya clutched her daughter and couldn't look away as Victor raised his claws for a killing blow. Victor's claws descended in an arc meant to end the fight, meant to tear through Lucien's throat and spine in one devastating motion, but Lucien twisted at the last second, and the silver claws scraped against stone instead, sending sparks flying, and he used Victor's momentary imbalance to roll away and come up in a crouch. Blood ran down Lucien's side from the gashes across his ribs, soaking into his pants, dripping onto the dirt floor, and Maya could see the exhaustion in every line of his body, the way he favored his injured shoulder, the tremor in his hands. Victor turned with a snarl, his dead coal eyes fixed on Lucien like a predator that had scented wounded prey, and he charged again, all that terrible mass moving with focused intent. But Lucien had been watching, had been calculating even while bleeding, and when Victor committed to the charge, Lucien dropped low and swept his leg in a calculated strike that connected with Victor's right knee. The joint that buckled slightly when he moved, old injury healed wrong over centuries of accumulated damage. Victor stumbled, just a half step, just enough, and the crowd's roar shifted tone, surprise mixing with bloodlust. Lucien pressed the advantage, moving inside Victor's guard, landing strikes to vulnerable points that wouldn't kill but would weaken. And Victor swung wildly, his claws opening new cuts on Lucien's back, his arms. But Lucien kept moving, kept striking, and slowly, terribly slowly, Victor began to slow. The bigger vampire was breathing hard now, something vampires rarely did, and blood ran from a dozen wounds, black and thick in the torchlight. In a brief lull while they circled each other, both bleeding and exhausted, Victor spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel scraped over concrete. "I killed your mentor. You know," he said, and there was something almost conversational in his tone. "Lord Sebastian. He begged at the end, begged me to spare his bloodline, to let his progeny live." Lucien's eyes narrowed, but he didn't rise to the bait, didn't let rage cloud his judgment. "Sebastian taught me one thing," Lucien replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "Mercy is the sharpest weapon." He feinted left, and Victor took it, committed his weight to blocking a strike that never came, and Lucien went right instead, His claws extended and severed Victor's Achilles tendon with surgical precision. Victor collapsed with a roar that shook dust from the stone ceiling, going down hard on his knees, and his silver claws scraped furrows in the dirt as he tried to rise and couldn't, the tendon too damaged to support his massive frame. The crowd fell silent, the sudden absence of sound more shocking than the roaring had been, and Lucian stood over Victor, breathing hard, blood running down his arms and chest and back in rivulets that made dark patterns on his skin. Tradition demanded he finish it now, that he reach into Victor's chest and tear out his heart for the crowd, proof of victory, proof of dominance, the way these things had always been settled. Maya watched from the alcove, her daughter pressed against her chest, and she could see the calculation in Lucian's face, the weight of centuries of vampire culture pressing down on him. But then Lucian looked up at her, at the baby wrapped in his leather jacket, at Maya's face pale with fear and hope, and something else she couldn't name, and he stepped back. "I yield the kill," Lucien said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. "He's beaten. He can't stand. The duel is over." Shocked silence followed his words, broken only by Victor's ragged breathing and the crackle of torches. Cassandra Voss stood at the edge of the pit, her face a mask of fury barely contained. "That's not how this works," she said, her voice sharp and cold. "Finish him or forfeit the victory. Those are the rules." Lucien met her gaze, his eyes still crimson from the fight. "I won by your rules," he said. "First blood to surrender or death." He gestured to Victor, still on his knees. "He can't stand. He surrendered by physical incapacity. I claim victory and invoke the terms. The child goes free. I'm reinstated." Cassandra opened her mouth to argue, but Dr. Rashid's voice cut through from the alcove, clear and authoritative as he read from his tablet. "Montreal Accords, Appendix K," he announced. "Mercy granted in sanctioned dual transfers honor debt to the defeated party's house. By the act of sparing his opponent's life when death was warranted, the victor claims all debts and obligations owed by the defeated party's bloodline." He looked up from the screen, meeting Cassandra's eyes across the pit. "By sparing Victor Cross, Lucian Thorne has just claimed House Armitage's debt. They owe him now." The crowd erupted in whispers, vampires turning to each other in confusion and calculation, and Cassandra's expression shifted through rage to something colder and more calculating. "Clever," she said after a long moment, and her smile was slow and dangerous. "Very clever. But the duel was for the child's freedom and your reinstatement. Maya Chen's contract is still in play." She paused, theatrical, letting the words hang. "Unless she can name a supernatural guardian right now, in this pit, witnessed by this assembly. Otherwise, the debt bond remains incomplete, and we can still claim the child under consilium law." Maya felt her heart stop, because she understood the trap. Understood that Cassandra had been planning this from the beginning, layer upon layer of legal maneuvering designed to back them into corners. But Dr. Rashid was already moving, already unlocking her bed and helping her stand, his hands steady despite everything. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly, and Maya nodded, gripping his arm as the world swayed. Her body screamed at her, too soon after birth, too much blood loss, but she held her daughter tight and let Dr. Rashid guide her down the stone steps into the pit, each step sending jolts of pain through her core. The vampires in the gallery watched in silence, hundreds of eyes tracking her descent, and Maya felt their attention like weight, like judgment, but she kept moving. The pit floor was soft under her bare feet, dirt and sand and dark stains that might have been old blood, and she walked toward Lucian, who stood in the center still bleeding, still magnificent in his exhaustion. He looked at her with something like wonder, like he couldn't believe she was there, and then he knelt before her, going down on both knees in the dirt, and the gesture was so unexpected, so humble from someone who'd been a king, that Maya's throat went tight. The baby stirred against her chest, awake now, her dark eyes watching everything. "I name her Elise Thorne Chen," Maya said, and her voice carried in the stone silence, stronger than she'd expected. In honor of a sister lost and a future gained. She saw Lucien's breath catch, saw something break in his face, and reform into something softer. And I name Lucien Thorne as her guardian, bound by blood debt and freely given trust. The words felt like power, like magic. And maybe they were because the air in the pit changed, became charged with something old and binding. Lucien placed his hand over the baby's heart, over Elise's heart, his palm barely spanning her tiny chest, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. I, Lucien Thorne, accept this charge, he said. I vow to protect Elise Thorne Chen until she comes of age, to educate her in both worlds, to die before I let harm touch her. His hand began to glow faintly silver, old magic responding to old words. Binding magic that had existed long before vampire politics or human laws. The light spread from his palm across Elise's chest, sinking into her skin, and the baby made a small sound that might have been contentment. The vampire crowd murmured, a sound like wind through dead leaves, and then 3 figures stepped forward, compelled by tradition and law to witness what was happening. Dr. Rashid came first, standing beside Maya, his hand on her shoulder in support. I witness this vow, he said clearly. I acknowledge the bond between guardian and ward. Cassandra Voss stepped to the edge of the pit, her face unreadable. But law was law and she was bound by it. I witness this vow, she said, the words dragged out of her by obligation. I acknowledge the bond, though I despise it. And then, shockingly, Victor Cross dragged himself upright using the pit wall for support, his severed tendon leaving a trail of blood as he limped forward on one leg. I witness this vow, he rasped, his dead coal eyes fixed on Lucien with something that might have been respect. And I acknowledge my defeat. House Armitage's debt stands. The crowd's murmur grew louder, confusion and shock rippling through the gallery. Maya looked around for something sharp, something to complete the ritual, and found a piece of broken stone, its edge jagged and dark. She shifted Elise in her arms and drew the stone across her palm, wincing as it bit deep, blood welling bright and red in the torchlight. Lucien did the same with one of his claws, opening his already damaged palm further, and they pressed their hands together, blood mingling, and touched their joined hands to Elise's forehead. The baby's skin absorbed the blood like earth absorbing rain, the marks spreading and then fading, invisible but permanent, written into her very cells. The bond was sealed. The air in the pit released with an almost audible snap, and Maya swayed, suddenly exhausted beyond measure, and Lucien caught her with his free arm, steadying her, still holding Elise between them. Cassandra stared down at them, her mercury eyes cold as winter. This isn't over, she said. The Countess will want compensation for the broken betrothal, for the loss of House Armitage's honor, for all of it. But she was backing toward the exit, legally outmaneuvered, trapped by the very laws she'd tried to use against them. Enjoy your hollow victory, Lucien, she called back. You're still kingless, still hunted. Still marked. Lucien stood, helping Maya to her feet, supporting most of her weight as her legs threatened to give out. I have everything I need right here, he said, looking at Maya and Elise, and his voice carried conviction that made Cassandra's expression twist with something that might have been envy before she turned and swept from the chamber, her purple gown trailing behind her like blood. The crowd began to disperse, vampires filing out through exits Maya hadn't noticed, their formal dress and hungry faces fading into shadow, and soon it was just the 3 of them in the pit, plus Dr. Rashid and Victor, who sat against the wall breathing hard and watching them with those dead eyes. You spared me, Victor said after a long moment. Why? Lucien looked at him, at this creature who'd killed his mentor and tried to kill him. Because Sebastian was wrong about one thing, Lucien said. He thought mercy was weakness, but it's the only thing that separates us from monsters. Victor was silent for a long time, then he nodded once, sharp and final. The debt is acknowledged, he said. House Armitage owes House Thorne. I will carry that message to the Countess myself. He dragged himself to his feet and limped toward one of the exits, leaving a trail of blood behind him, and then he was gone, and they were alone in the pit that smelled of earth and blood and old magic. Dr. Rashid came down to help them, supporting Maya on one side while Lucian held her on the other, and they made their way slowly back to the elevator, back to the surface, back to the world of fluorescent lights and antiseptic and normalcy that felt impossibly far away from what had just happened in the depths below. Dawn light filtered through the hospital windows in shades of rose and gold, turning the delivery room into something almost beautiful, and Maya lay in the bed freshly stitched and stable, her body aching but healing, while Elise slept in the bassinet beside her, one tiny hand curled around Maya's finger through the plastic bars. Lucian sat slumped in a plastic chair that was too small for him, his head tipped back against the wall, eyes closed, and Maya could see the toll the night had taken written in every line of his body, the bandages covering his wounds, the pallor of his skin even paler than usual, the exhaustion that came from fighting and bleeding and binding himself to a future he hadn't planned. What happens now? Maya asked quietly, not wanting to wake Elise but needing to know, needing some sense of what came after this impossible night. Lucien's eyes stayed closed, but she saw his jaw tighten. "We disappear," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "I have safe houses the consilium doesn't know about, places that were mine before I became king, before politics and alliances mattered. You and Elise will be protected there." "And you?" Maya asked, because the way he said it made it sound like he might not be included in that future. Lucian opened his eyes, and they were no longer crimson, just dark and human tired, the eyes of someone who'd given everything and wasn't sure what was left. "I teach her," he said. "Keep my vow. Hope the Countess gets bored before she gets vengeful, though that's probably wishful thinking." He looked at Elise sleeping peacefully. "She doesn't know how to let things go." The door opened, and Dr. Rashid entered carrying a manila envelope that he set on the table beside Maya's bed with careful deliberation. "You didn't get these from me," he said. And when Maya opened the envelope, she found documents that looked official and worn: a birth certificate listing Lucien Thorne as Elise's father, a passport with Elise's photo somehow already attached, a social security card with a number that would pass any database check. Dr. Rashid handed Maya a business card, plain white with just a phone number embossed in black. "If you need medical help," he said, "there's a network. Doctors who know about your situation, who can treat both human and supernatural concerns without asking questions." He glanced at Lucien. "Some of us remember what it was like before the consilium consolidated power, when the old families actually protected humans instead of just using them." Maya took the card, sliding it into the pocket of the hospital gown they'd given her. "What happened to Derek?" she asked, and Dr. Rashid's expression softened slightly. "Police took him away hours ago," he said. "Assault, breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, illegal possession of a firearm. Cassandra's rescue was caught on security footage, very convenient for building a case. He'll be in prison for years, probably a decade if the prosecutor is competent." Maya exhaled and felt something loosen in her chest. A weight she'd been carrying for 3 weeks of running and 3 days of captivity, and longer than that if she was honest, years of walking on eggshells around Derek's temper. "He can't hurt you anymore," Dr. Rashid said gently. "That part of your life is over." Lucien stood and moved to the window, his movements careful around his injuries, and stood looking out at the city waking up below, at traffic beginning to build on the streets, at people going about their normal lives completely unaware of what had happened in the depths beneath this building. Maya watched his reflection in the glass, faint but there, and realized she could see it at all, that he cast a reflection when folklore said vampires shouldn't. "You're not like the others, are you?" she said. Lucian touched the pendant at his throat, the thorned crown that had glowed with power in the pit and now sat dark and dormant against his skin. I was, he said quietly. For a very long time I was exactly like them, playing politics, making alliances, doing terrible things because that's what kings do. He turned to face her, leaning against the window frame. Maybe this is my chance to be something different. Maybe Elise is my chance. The week that followed passed in a blur of healing and paperwork and quiet moments, Maya's body knitting itself back together while Elise thrived, nursing well and sleeping in the long stretches that made the nurses jealous. Lucien stayed close, sleeping in the chair beside Maya's bed during the day when his kind were naturally dormant, disappearing at night to handle things he didn't explain and Maya didn't ask about. On the seventh day, Dr. Rashid cleared Maya for discharge, and Lucian appeared with a nondescript sedan, dark blue and unremarkable, its windows tinted darker than legal, but no one was going to pull them over for it. Maya's belongings fit in 2 bags because everything she owned had fit in the backpack she'd run with, plus a few things the hospital had provided, and Lucien loaded them into the trunk with careful efficiency while Maya settled Elise into a car seat that looked brand new. They drove north through the city and then beyond, past suburbs and into countryside, and Lucian explained they were heading to another city, one where vampires and humans coexisted under uneasy truce, where the consilium's reach was limited by local politics and old treaties. The apartment was above a bookstore on a quiet street lined with maples, modest but secure. And when Lucian unlocked the door, Maya saw symbols carved into the frame, protective wards in languages she didn't recognize. He showed her through the space, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, and a living room with windows that faced the street, and then he showed her the panic room hidden behind a bookshelf, the exit routes through the bedroom window and the bathroom skylight, the phone that connected directly to his network of allies. "You're not a prisoner," he said, watching her face carefully. "But until the debt is settled, until House Armitage accepts the terms and the Countess agrees to leave you alone, you're safest here." "What if I want to stay anyway?" Maya said, and Lucian turned to look at her. She was feeding Elise on the couch, the baby nursing contentedly, and Lucien was assembling a crib in the corner, a screwdriver in his hand and instructions spread across the floor in that uniquely domestic scene that felt surreal given everything. What if this, whatever this is better than anything I had before? Lucian paused, the screwdriver held loosely in his grip, and something crossed his face that might have been hope or might have been fear. "Then we figure it out," he said after a moment. "Together." That night, Elise wouldn't stop crying, her tiny face red and scrunched, and Maya walked her around the apartment trying everything, singing and rocking and checking her diaper and trying to nurse again. But nothing worked, and exhaustion made Maya's hands shake and her eyes blur with tears. Lucian appeared in the doorway, barefoot and wearing a t-shirt Maya hadn't seen before, looking more human than he ever had. "Let me try," he said. And Maya handed Elise over with relief and guilt mixed together. Lucien walked the apartment with the baby against his shoulder, singing that French lullaby in his low voice, the one about stars and sailing and coming home, and Elise quieted almost immediately, her dark eyes fixed on his face, like he was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. Maya watched from the bedroom doorway, watched this vampire king who'd given up everything rock her daughter with a gentleness that made her chest ache, and she felt something warm and terrifying blooming there. Something that felt dangerously like trust, or maybe something deeper. The letter arrived 3 days later, slipped under the door while they were sleeping. No postmark or return address, just a wax seal in deep burgundy bearing House Armitage's crest. Lucian found it when he woke at dusk, and Maya watched his expression harden as he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of heavy paper inside. "The Countess requests an audience," he read aloud, his voice flat. "Midnight, 3 days hence. Come alone, or we come for all of you." He looked up at Maya, at Elise sleeping in her bassinet, and his jaw was tight with controlled fury. "I won't let them take you," he said. "I know," Maya replied, but they both understood the words were easier than the reality, that somewhere the Countess was planning her response to being outmaneuvered, that the debt claimed in the pit was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. The real battle was just beginning. That night, Lucian stood at the window watching the street below, his eyes flashing crimson in the reflection. A reminder of what he was beneath the gentleness, what he'd given up, what he was willing to become again if it meant keeping them safe. Behind him, Maya hummed the French lullaby, her voice soft and human and hopeful, rocking Elise in her arms while the baby drowsed. The city sprawled below them, full of danger and possibility, full of vampires and humans, and the uneasy spaces where their worlds collided. Somewhere in the dark, the Countess was planning her next move, calculating how to punish Lucian for his defiance and reclaim what she believed was owed. But here in this apartment above a bookstore, with wards carved into the doorframe and a crib assembled in the corner, 3 people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances were building something fragile and fierce, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. Lucien turned from the window and looked at Maya and Elise, at this makeshift family he'd bound himself to, and for the first time in 400 years, he felt something that might have been purpose or might have been peace. Outside, the night deepened, and the city breathed, and somewhere clocks were counting down to midnight 3 days hence. But for now they were safe. For now they were together. And that would have to be enough.